Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Chapter 5 of his work on moral virtue, Plutarch is going to bring in an important distinction between, we could say, two different domains or uses of the faculty of reason, that's logos, in us human beings, and it's going to be one that will be connected to a number of important distinctions. It's not something that, of course, he's coming up with himself. You could say that it's drawn from both the Platonist and the Aristotelian traditions that he's bringing together, which are around for centuries by this point. And he's going to begin by talking about a distinction between two different sets of things within the universe that we can be interested in. So one of these are things that we can say exist absolutely. The absolutely there is haplos, which can also be translated as simply or in themselves. And the existing is ekonta, so things that you could say hold themselves or cohere. And literally things, pragmata, right? So what are those? Well, he gives you some examples: earth, heavens, stars, the sea. So we might say the features of the natural world, at least the ones that we think are constant, the ones that are unchanging. Now, of course, the ancient Mediterranean people had a different cosmology than we do. The earth is in the center of the universe, and then there's the various planets and stars above them, and everything above the moon is going to be this area of perfect cohesion and order. We don't think that way anymore. We see things as a bit more chaotic, but we could say, astronomy, insofar as it is revealing to us the constant nature of these processes, physics, chemistry, we could go on and on and on, right? So these things are permanent, they're unchanging. We can actually be certain about them. Why? Because they're not contingent. He doesn't use the word necessary, but they can't be otherwise. So that's an important domain. And then we have the rest of the messy world that we live in. And interestingly, Plutarch is not going to talk about every possible thing that falls into this class. He talks about things that are, as it's translated, in relation to us. Pros, hemas. Pros is a Greek term that is used for relation. Hemas is us, right? Us human beings. And what would those be? Well, he gives you some examples here. The good and the bad, right? So the agathon and the kakon. The choiceworthy, or as it's translated here, desirable, right? The things that literally ought to be pursued, and those that we ought to avoid or flee from. And then even the pleasant and the painful. And we could add all sorts of other things to this: the useful and the harmful, the just and the unjust. And Plutarch, in saying that these are in relation to us, is not embracing some sort of relativism. You might think, if you're, considering ancient Greek philosophers, that he's reincarnating Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. He's not saying, hey, anything goes in these matters. He's saying these are messier. These are murkier. There's more, as he's going to call it, wandering or confusion, plane in these matters. So they are changing, right? They're not changing completely, but there's variable aspects to these. They involve chance or fortune to some degree, tuche, right? They're contingent. They don't have to always pan out the way that they do. So, just to take the pleasant and the painful, well, most of us find certain things pleasant. It's enough of a constant that we can say, we can build entire food industries based on what people like to eat and rejecting other things. But there could be some people who are outliers, right? Who don't fit the model. And so that's possible. And there could be some things that are good in most circumstances, but are actually bad in certain other circumstances. And so here's where we get to reason. So he goes on and he says, reason contemplates, theorein, both of these sort of areas, right? But we call it by different names. We have scientific and contemplative reason. So epistemonikon and theoretikon, right? It's the same word for contemplating. So when we're looking at and we actually have knowledge about things like this, then we have theoretical reason, right? And in other cases, we are engaging in deliberation, bouletikon. We're thinking about, is this really the case? How should we behave? We weigh things back and forth. Now, he's going to say that we don't do this in every single case. He says, to deliberate when a case is doubtful is part of what practical reason does. And then to reduce deliberation to practice in activities where decisions are accompanied by and influenced by the irrational, right? So we have the deliberative, the bouletikon, and the practical, the praktikon, when it comes to this kind of reason. It's the same faculty of reason that's doing both of these jobs in relation to different sorts of things. So these are all important matters. And there's different virtues or excellences that are associated with this. So on the side of the theoretical, the unchanging, we have the virtue of wisdom, Sophia. On the other side, we have practical wisdom or prudence, phronesis, right? And he's going to say that wisdom doesn't actually need to deliberate. It just needs to figure out the way things are. So, maybe it wavers back and forth in coming up with an explanation for something. But once it's figured it out, it doesn't need to deliberate. Do I need to do more experiments or something along those lines? Whereas prudence does have to deliberate about things that are going to be a little bit up for grabs or confusing. So he says, a geometer, so geometry would belong to this, does not deliberate whether the triangle has its internal angles equal to two right angles. It adds up to 180 degrees. He knows it to be true, right? So prudence often does have to consider matters that are kind of confusing. Is this really choice-worthy, or should I, in this circumstance, avoid this thing? Will this actually be pleasant for that person over there, or is this going to turn out to be painful for them? So we can point out another important difference here as well. He's going to say that wisdom, theoretical reason, these sorts of matters, they don't involve any sort of mean in that virtue of wisdom. Wisdom just is what it is. It's great if you have it. Not so great if you don't have it. Wisdom remains great. It's just not great that you don't have it. And it doesn't have any involvement with what he calls the passions or the emotions, the pathe. Prudence, on the other hand, it's not all about the passions, but a large part of it does involve a mean, a middle position. And you might say, whoa, isn't that Aristotelianism? Yes, but it's also Middle Platonism, because Plutarch thinks that the doctrine of the mean is something quite important for ethics and for virtue, and he's willing to go down that route. So it involves a mean that is imposed on what he calls an impulse, a horme in Greek, imposed by prudence on it. And that is going to lead to the passions, or the emotions, the pathe, having certain limits placed upon them. It isn't completely, you could say, negative or restricting, though, because he's going to tell us, quite interestingly, that, so here's the passage. The impulsion or impulse of passion springs from moral virtue, but it needs reason to keep it in moderate bounds, to give it, limits, you could say, and to prevent its exceeding or falling short of its proper occasion. And he says, sometimes the passionate and irrational part of ourselves moves too violently and swiftly, but at other times it moves more weakly and slothfully, lazily, than the case demands. So reason, practical reason, comes in to give us the, we could say, rule or principle or guidance in these things. So he says that this is the natural task of practical reason, to eliminate the defects and the excesses of the passions, sometimes through infirmity, weakness, or fear and hesitation. The impulse, the horme, yields too soon and forsakes the good, misses the good, right? Or the beautiful, the kalon. And so what happens? Practical reason comes to incite and rekindle the impulse. Other times the impulse is borne beyond proper bounds, flowing powerfully in disorder. There, practical reason removes its violence and checks it. And so what do we have here? Well, practical reason works on the irrational part of ourselves that has these impulses, which then take the shape of emotions or passions, and it keeps them within proper limits, and limits that are restricting both defect and excess. And so that's a big part of what practical reason does. You don't need to do that when you're looking at the planets or thinking about logic or anything like that. But when it comes to human affairs and all of these really important moral qualities, we might say, well, then you do need that. So this leads us to something like a doctrine of the mean, which is not exactly the same thing as the Aristotelian one, as we'll see shortly, but that's just for practical reasons. So we have this great distinction made here between not two different kinds of reason, but two different employments of the faculty of reason that we, as rational animals, have as human beings.